Do you dream of making the world a better place for others by sharing your story and being an advocate? Do you have a desire to make a powerful impact on the world? Well, you are going to love this episode because in this episode of Full and Thriving, you will hear from Courtney Diener, a supervisee in social work, a trauma survivor, and advocate who has powerfully shared her story to pave the way for others to share theirs. As a social worker, Courtney seeks to create an environment where clients feel safe enough, affirmed, and supported by using a strengths-based approach that centers compassion and a deep respect for the therapeutic relationship as a powerful tool in growing, in healing, and recovery. I know you will love this episode because Courtney is truly an inspiring human who will motivate you to use your voice and fight for a better world. Get ready for this amazing episode of Full and Thriving. Hi, Courtney. Welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm really glad to be talking to you today for your podcast. I was really excited to even just, see you and to have this conversation.
I was feeling so much energy when I woke up today because you have been a part of the Recovery Collective. I've known you for a few years now. I follow you on Instagram, and I was just so excited to hear from you, like coming back from maternity leave, just to see that familiar face and like hook back into the world that I kind of left for a few months feels so good. So it's so nice to see you.
It's nice to see you too. And I think for me, like this idea of we've worked in like a recovery space, and to be able to talk to you more generally is pretty cool too. It's kind of like a little full circle. So I love that.
Yes. And I think that's one really beautiful thing about like getting to know people in the recovery space is that everyone has their own unique personality, and recovery is not the only thing that defines them.
Mm-hmm.
And when I have gotten to know you over the years, it's very clear to me that you are a strong advocate and activist out in the world. And it's a part of your personality that's undeniable, whether it's recovery related or not. It's something I really admire about you, which is why I wanted to have you on the show. So I'm really excited to talk to you about that today.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about it too. It's definitely been a very long journey. It's been a big part of my life. And so I was like, yeah, this is perfect. I love this topic.
Good. So I guess to start, I wanted to ask you to please share a little bit about your professional background and also how you became this advocate / activist voice out in the world.
Yeah. I feel like I've had a little bit of a mixed personal journey professional journey too, because I have had lots of moments in my career where I've wanted to do different things, and then I've kind of pivoted and changed. And so when I first went to college, I thought for sure I was going to be a high school English teacher. And it was because I loved reading and writing, and that was like so healing for me that I was like, I want to share that with others. I want them to be able to have that same experience. And so I actually did some I have a bachelor's in education, and I did some student teaching, and then I started working with students, and they actually had all of these other things happening in their lives. And I started to notice that and realizing that yes, I loved that I could teach about writing, but I didn't care if they could write perfectly. I didn't care about their grammar. I didn't care if they read a particular book. I cared what was happening with them. And so I added social work to my bachelor's and then went on to get a master's in social work. But I really at first focused on community advocacy. My program was called Community Practice for Social Change. And this idea that you could do policy work and advocacy work and lots of more macro ideas. But then during my program, I was like, oh, I actually want to work one-on-one with people too. And so it's kind of this space where I have gone all over the place with my career. And I actually am starting to realize that all of it was advocacy, just in different ways. And so I'm a therapist, but I am pre-licensed because I'm coming back to the field. I had a career for 10 years as a survivor advocate. So on college campuses. And then I worked for some crisis centers, some rape crisis centers. And I would help them through the system, whether it was reporting to Title IX, whether it was reporting to the police, whether it was not reporting and getting access to resources, some healing work, finding them a therapist. And then eventually during COVID, I started missing the longer term, like interactions with folks. And so I was like, you know what? I'm thinking about this piece of going back. And I was a little burnout working in higher education. And so I decided that I would go back and become a therapist again. And so I am pre-licensure, but I'm very close to license. And I have been really enjoying it. And I still work for a college, so I get a little bit of both. So I get to interact with lots of people in lots of stages of their lives. And I am also a PhD student. And so I really enjoy research and teaching. And research for me is just a way of learning more information about folks. And so I'm what's called a phenomenological researcher. And so I like to collect lived experiences, I think, which really lends towards where I'm going with and what I like to do around advocacy. I just felt like a need to hear people differently. And so I'm studying college professionals and how they experience their environment related to trauma-informed care, because I started seeing all this burnout and all of these really hard things happening for these staff. And so my career has been kind of like a meld of all of these things. I find a passion and I go with it for a while, and then I feel like I find my next passion and I go with that. But currently therapist and working in higher education.
Wow. I'm really impressed with your history. I didn't know your whole career. We actually have something in common. I did crisis support. I was on a hotline. I was a hotline
I love
counselor
that.
for a year, but not as long as you, obviously.
Yeah, but it still matters. It's so important. And I think that's really good experience too, where you get to just be with people on a really raw time, and you end up knowing a lot about humanity and also just each other. And so that's awesome. I did not know that about you either. I'm really glad that was a thing.
Yeah, I would go to the hospital for the rape collection kits and all of that. That was really eye-opening and a heavy emotional lift. So the fact that you were able to do that for 10 years is something.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. Interestingly, it definitely was emotional, but I have to be honest, it was never, the things that burnt me out were never the survivors that I was working with. And it was always the systems that were impacting the survivors. And so, I would tell people you're sitting on a plane and you're do you tell them what you do? Do you not tell them what you do? It's always a risk, right? And so I would tell folks, and people are that's an issue on college campuses. And you're that must be so hard. And I'm yeah, but no, not really. It's, it's the watching them try to seek out services and then be denied or rejected or need something different. And that's what really, kind of burned a hole in my heart and made it harder to do that work. And so, but I feel like in my career, I worked with thousands of survivors, and I just feel like they all come with me, and I just have parts of them with me. And also I think that's what's led to some of this advocacy space too, because I just saw time and time again people being let down in spaces where they didn't realize that they were going to be, where they expected more, where they thought it was going to be different. And so that just builds some fire and some passion to look at things and want things to be different.
Yes. Wow. Do you have a common thread behind all of your advocacy work that you could name? I mean, that's a huge question. Maybe there are multiple themes.
Yeah. I think probably the biggest thread is this idea of the unheard or not having a voice. And so and I think it started actually with me in my life, not being heard and not having a voice, and then having to fight for that. And so that's something that I needed. And I would have, when I was younger, I would have never been able to vocalize that or know that's what I needed, but it was. And then I started listening to other folks. And then I think that is the thread is so many spaces are people kind of asking for something or wanting something, often resources, but also I think just being heard and being supported and not questioned. And so that's probably the theme is people's voices not always being heard for their experiences and wanting that to be different, just wanting that to be the first and most important thing, and then figuring out everything afterwards.
That is such a wonderful theme, right? Being the voice for the people who aren't heard, helping people find that voice and maybe hopefully get the services and treatment and resources that they need, or at least bridging that gap, like where there's that lack of support that they expected.
And I think it's starting the voice. Like, it's not about being their voice, but it's like over time, like clearing away so that folks can have their voice. Because I think, I have my lived experience and they have their lived experiences, and I want to clear the way so that their lived experiences are heard. I mean, it's just like the most subtle difference. I think it's important. And that's actually, I think, part of my growth and learning too. I think for a long time, I was like, I'm going to talk about sexual assault. I'm going to talk about eating disorders and body, and I'm going to talk about systems of harm and mental health with this idea that like me talking about it would be enough. But now I've kind of gotten to this space. I was like, no, I need to like talk about it enough so that people are able to talk about it for themselves and to be able to have the spaces that they deserve.
That is such a helpful nuance. Like, it's a subtle shift in language, but it means so much. And I'm so appreciative that you pointed that out, because it's very true. Like, first of all, there is a place for everyone's story. Like, when people start their work and their journey, usually it is from a place of, I need to share my own story. But then the beautiful thing about sharing your own story is that you're kind of opening the door and giving people permission to share their story too. It gives people that courage to step out and be like, hey, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one who has a story. And I saw how this person's story changed my life and gave me, courage to speak up. So here I am now standing in my truth. So that is so helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I was like, I just had the subtlest, and I think because I've thought about that a lot, that used to be something that I would almost kind of embody. And then I was like, I don't want to take up all of the space. Like, I deserve space and I should have my voice heard. But then there's this other piece where it's like, okay, but like, I'm privileged in the ways that I am. I have my own experiences. And so how do I make sure that I'm not just being like, here, give me the mic? It's like, no, I want everybody to have access to the mic. Or if they don't want the mic, I want them to not need it, because people are already listening to them and hearing them and understanding what they've been through. I don't think anyone owes us their story for us to like care about something, but I want us to have the ability to hear them regardless, right? Like, I'm sure with like your work with the Crisis Center, like, I think knowing that like I never needed to hear a survivor's story to know that sexual violence was an issue. I didn't, right? Like, I knew that was a thing. And so I think very similarly, how do we like pave the way so folks can share when they want to, and we can hear them and listen, and that can be really empowering, and then they don't have to, and we care still. And I think it's like speaking out and like that advocacy space is really complicated for those reasons. Yeah.
I think the speaking out, like, one thing that I love about making that space for people is that it helps dissolve that tension, right? It's like when you feel like someone finally understands you or hears you, it takes away the power of that story a little bit, like, or the shame you have around that story.
Yeah. I think the amount of times, like, I or people I work with start to share, and then other people are like, yeah, me too. Like, yeah, that's something that I get. Like, I understand, or I didn't have it like that, but like, it's a relatable feeling or relatable empathy. I'd say like the time when I got sort of my voice the most was when I was in college. And I'm a survivor of child abuse. I'm a survivor of some sexual trauma. And I wanted to do something about it, and I didn't know what to do. And I was in the schools, and I had a student who had experienced sexual violence, and I was the person that was told. And so it was this whole mandated reporting thing, which I watched how that wasn't working for this student. But then also I was like, I've had this experience. This kid has had this experience. How many other folks are having this experience? And so I started a student organization called the Collegiate Against Child Abuse. I was like very gung-ho, like, we all have to learn about this. And one of the things that was most amazing was that my friends all were like, I don't know that much about this topic, but I'm with you. I'll join your organization. I'll help you figure it out. And so we did like trainings on child abuse, and so that people could learn more about it. But then we had an event called the Child Abuse Remembrance Ceremony, where we would talk to people in our county, particularly kids in our county who had lost their lives due to child abuse. And we always wanted to have speakers talk about their stories of healing. And so I was the first person that spoke, but I had never like really publicly spoken about my own story. And so I remember like, it was a small crowd, like there was like 40-ish people there, and like just kind of stepping out, having a mic in my hand and being like, okay, well, I'm doing this. I'm going to talk about my own experience. And when I did that, I like shared, and it was for me, I was a little bit disconnected because I was a little scared. Like, the first time when you're sharing something, it can be almost unreal. I'm like, this is my experience and it's coming out of my mouth and I'm hearing it, but like, I'm not feeling it. But then I like turned over and like some of my friends and people that I'd known for a while were all like crying because they didn't realize I had that experience. And then a couple of them walked up to me afterwards and was like, no, me too. Like I've had these experiences. And so for me, I think it was a like, oh, like they didn't know. They see me as this person that has, I think I put on a little bit of a mask during that time. So they saw me in a particular way. But then also, I think this idea of like there was so much like relatability and like others had that experience. And that just kept happening. Every time we'd like host something or bring something, we'd have that. Survivors would come forward, or if it wasn't a survivor, it'd be someone else. I'd be like, I didn't know all this and now I need to know more. And so I think that probably was what like was the fuel for me where I like had that experience. I was like such a like connective experience, like where two souls could like stop for a second and have that similar experience. And so it built a little bit of my confidence because I was like, okay, I have something to talk about that people relate to. It's okay to talk about it. This is like this taboo topic, but it's okay to talk about it. And then also this idea of like, what does that mean to then open up and allow other people to talk about it? And so I think that's kind of my foundation. And that's where I also built this, like, you can talk about it if you want to, but you don't have to, because so much of this is like so sensitive and so hard to talk about. And I know I'm talking very like specific to my experiences, but so much of what we are as humans is, very sensitive and personal and vulnerable to us, no matter what it is.
Thank you for sharing that story of your first time sharing something so major in your life. And I'm just really curious, like for people listening who haven't shared their story, what would you recommend to people who are considering maybe starting to speak out?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite questions. First and foremost, I would want them to know that everything should be about them. Like in that moment, if you're thinking about sharing, it's like, is this right for me? Is this what I want to do? And that's what you should go with. And I think sometimes we pressure folks to share. We think that we have to hear their story, or that like you have to share all these details in order to be heard. And that isn't always the case. That isn't often the case. Sometimes it's that connective piece of like, hey, I've struggled. Oh, I've struggled too. Let's kind of talk and engage. So that's first and foremost, is kind of to do a little bit of an internal, like, what do I want to share? What's helpful about this for me? And it's this idea of like, I don't know if you see the meme that kind of floats around that's like, recovering out loud, I think is the thing that they talk about. And I think that's so meaningful. And like, I like to have this big and to it, to be like, that's so meaningful, because a lot of us, we need to see that. And you don't have to be that person if it's not right for your life. And so that's the first piece, is to like really do an assessment. But if it feels right, I'm all about it. I think that's amazing. And so then figuring out, okay, what do I want to share? Like, what's helpful for me to share, and who do I share it to? Not everybody deserves access to your story or your experience. And it's really important to protect that, I think, and to share with people who are meaningful to you. And so I often think it's important to be like, okay, like who in my life are folks that might hear me? If you've got someone in your life who maybe they haven't stopped and given you space, they might not be the first person you share with, because they might not be ready to hear you. And, like you deserve that. And so I definitely recommend that piece of thinking through where you want to share. I think sometimes thinking about like, what am I comfortable sharing? What am I not comfortable sharing can be really helpful. Because like thinking back to that first moment, I have the mic in my hand and I'm like, almost like blurry vision. I don't know that I would have been able to fully just think on my feet. Okay, this feels comfortable in this moment. And I had a speech that I had written. I didn't really even read it per se because I was so scared. But I think that space of like, okay, there might be some piece of this that I don't want to share. Or there might be pieces where it's really important for me to share. This feels key to my experience, and I hope people hear me on this. And so I think that's important. And I think the other piece is thinking about what happens if I share. And so if I share, it's out there, but also you get to set boundaries afterwards. And so like, I think for me, when I thought about sharing for a while, I was like, okay, well, everyone's just going to see me as this person like that was abused, and they're not going to see all the other parts of me. And I think that came from shame around the abuse. Like I was like, I don't know if I want people to know me like that. And I think once I started to share, I was like, oh, that's not my shame to carry. That's other folks' shame to carry. And I don't care if they see me like that because I am a whole human and I have all of these other things. And that is actually a part of what's made me me. I'm not proud of it. Like I'm not someone that's like that. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Like that's just never been my way of thinking, because that what doesn't kill you makes you have trauma and you have to like deal with that and go through it and figure it out. But it is a part of who I am. Like, I went on to have a 10-year career in survivor advocacy for a reason. And I think, that is related to my own experiences. And so I think that's a big piece, is knowing that you get to decide and then taking care of yourself through that. So I think this piece of no matter how sharing goes, you're okay. Like you're still you're still a human, you're especially a human. And so it probably won't go exactly as planned. You may not say things in the exact way you meant to. The idea of like giving yourself space is enough. Like if you were like trying, if you felt like I want to share something and I did, and maybe I didn't share it in the way I wanted to, but I shared it. I tried. I gave it space. And even if it's like I shared a line and then I was like, okay, that's it. I'm done. I think it's okay to really honor and be like, that was still something really big. And then the other piece is that you are not then responsible for others' responses to it, because we don't know how people in our lives are going to respond, whether well-intentioned, whether like without information, whatever it is. There's some folks in our lives that are harmful. And so maybe they can't hold it in the right way, but that's not your responsibility. And I think that's a big piece, is like, I'm going to say it in a way so people can hear me. And it's like, eventually you might want to get there if you want people to hear you on a broader scale, but it's your story, your experience. Say it however feels right for you. And so lots about self and like, how do you care for yourself in that sharing process? Yeah. I know that was a very long-winded way of saying it, but this is one of those really like pieces of, yes, share if you want to, and I think sharing is just such a vulnerable and connective experience, but it's terrifying for folks for good reason. We hear stories of people not being heard or listened to in different spaces, or we might have experiences growing up where we've had that. And so it does take a lot to share. And so when folks do, I hope we all can listen, but at the same time, it's not owed and it isn't a small fee. It's something that's pretty big.
Yeah, I agree with you there. It's like, there's a lot of discernment that is helpful, that I guess discernment is helpful in what you want to share with who, how much, and just one line is really important. I think that's so helpful. I know the first time I spoke about my eating disorder to someone outside of my family, it was like a coworker. I was a hostess at a restaurant. I just told the other hostess in like 2 sentences. And she just received it really well. She's like, wow, that really sucks. I'm so sorry you had to deal with that. She was like 10 years older than me and probably very like mature enough to handle that. And it kind of made me feel more connected to her. And so I always found that even the smallest acknowledgement of your struggle can be hugely connective, which is powerful. And also there is that line of you don't owe anyone anything. And you don't have to recover out loud. I did not talk about my eating disorder until I was like 90% of the way through. There was no way I was going to be out and proud while I was going through it. There's just so much shame.
Yeah. I think that makes so much sense. And also, I've been known to criticize like the pink donuts of recovery. I don't know if you have heard that kind of example. Like, it's this idea that like we think recovery, we think going through it, trauma and mental health is like pretty. And like, we're just going to classify it up and like you can just talk about it in that way. And it's like, no, this stuff is hard and it's personal and it's messy and it's up and down. And so I think this idea of like not presenting it too much in that way. And also some folks are like, I don't want to present it at all. I'm just going to deal with it. And then we'll figure out how folks in my life will understand it or know about it.
Yeah, exactly. So one thing I wanted to ask you is like, what do you think holds people back from using their voice? Like, what gets in the way if someone is afraid to share?
I think there's a lot of things that can come into play. I know that a big piece for folks is that we are like, I believe that humans are a lot of patterns. Like we become patterns of our lives. And so if we have had patterns or periods of time where folks haven't heard us, even when we're sharing something smaller or something different, that can kind of remind us of that space of what it feels like to not be heard or to be rejected or to feel like we don't have space to share. And so I think sometimes that like family rooting or that peer rooting that happens where it's like, I've tried to share parts of me, whether it's been like something like, oh, I'm really interested in this random topic, and then someone kind of puts it down, or it's like this big thing. I know, right? Like it's one of those things where it's sad because we should all be able to be passionate about whatever we want. But like, I work with not a ton, but some adolescents, and like, this idea of like, you have to like the cool thing is like big. And it's like, no, if you like for me, when I was growing up, I loved little plastic frogs. I don't know why. I don't get it, but I love to collect them. And I think about if I were to have shared that like now with what kids face, I would have been bullied so much. And I probably still would have shared, but like, I would have remembered that people couldn't hear the thing I'm liking. And so I think that piece of being afraid of what folks are going to say because of past patterns or past experiences.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned earlier too, this like shame piece.
Yeah.
Like it's such a big deal when we hold shame. It's like this piece of like, almost like wanting to like cover and be like, I can't share this. I can't do this. Folks are going to judge me or I'm judging me already. And I think that can get in the way of, sharing, especially, I think about this like trauma space, but then also like this eating disorder space, not that they're separate, but I think there can be so much shame. And so, of course, like sharing can be really challenging, even though the shame I often think isn't really theirs to hold and it comes from somewhere. And so I think that's a big piece of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm hearing a lot like shame and then fear of what other people think. And that was definitely a huge barrier. I would always fill in stories after I shared. I'd be like, oh, does this person know? What do they think about me now? Am I labeled? And not wanting to be seen as just that, which is what you were talking about before.
Yeah. That like, do they think about it when I walk into the room was a big thing for me with trauma. And I think can be for eating disorders. Like, every time we eat around each other, are you going to know this now and think about this? And it can be really challenging. I also think that sometimes sharing is like the opener, like it opens to more inside. And so by sharing, it's almost like you give a little bit of space and then people know about you. And that's really vulnerable and really hard. And it can also bring more, I think once someone starts talking, sometimes like there is some pain behind it, or there is some emotions that come out that maybe the person wasn't ready or isn't currently ready to share. And so I think that can get in the way of sharing because it's like, well, what if I can't stop crying? Or what if I can't zip it back up? And that does happen for folks sometimes. If we've put on this space where we're like, okay, like whether it's an eating disorder or trauma, like, or whatever is happening, we are protecting ourselves. There's some part of us that's protecting ourselves. And so maybe it is cutting off some of that sharing and vulnerability and connection. And then I'm going to like peel that back. And that means it's peeled. What if it just keeps peeling? And I think one piece to say is like, you always have the right to step away. You always have the right to be in a space where you don't share for a little bit. But that's a valid fear too, because emotions are hard and they are experiences where sometimes once you start, it is there. Then you have to kind of pull it out.
It's so vulnerable. I think that's a really big piece of the hesitation to share is like having to tap into that vulnerability and those emotions that could come flowing if you're not used to speaking about this topic. And then suddenly you're having to manage a bunch of outpouring emotions in front of people or in front of somebody. And that's scary.
Yeah.
a lot of people
Yeah.
don't want to cry in front of others. Like they feel shame around that because that's what they've been
Mhm.
taught.
Oh, 100%. I think even now, like people I worked with for a while where like they start crying in therapy, and I'm like, oh no, this is a perfect place to cry.
Yeah.
Like, all about it. I don't think you have to cry in therapy for it to be good therapy, but I think you're totally welcome to. And I think it's just so apparent the amount of pressure we put on that and like
Yeah.
being so strong. And sometimes crying is like strong. And actually often it
Yeah.
is, always is really.
And I'm sure you've had so many people apologize for crying. And
Mhm.
that, like, I've done that. I know
Oh,
there's
I've
people
done
like,
it
I'm so
too.
sorry. I'm so
Yeah.
sorry. I'm like, why are you? This is like literally the point. Like, please
Mhm.
feel what you need to feel right now, and it's okay. But yeah,
Mhm.
that is a huge one. But I wanted to circle back to a point that you made, which is like some people might not be ready to receive your
Mhm.
your story or your what you have to say. What do you what advice do you have for people when it's not met with kindness or respect or love?
Yeah. I think kind of similar to when you're thinking about sharing is like in that moment, it still becomes all about you and what you need. And so if it's someone in your life who you're like hoping they would respond in a particular way or they would have been supportive, it's okay to cut that off and to not speak about it anymore with them or to be like, you know what? We got to table this or like, I need to go. And then like not talking about it for a period of time is okay. Like kind of going back to the space of like, no one is entitled to that. I also think letting yourself have those feelings, because if you think someone in your life is going to be supportive and then they aren't, that's a time where it's okay, like to feel disappointed, to feel sad, to feel upset, because that is kind of a missed connection when it comes to our humanity. And so I think often we're like, a lot of the advice would be just like, just keep walking. And it doesn't matter. You don't have to care about what other folks are saying or thinking, but that's too simple. Like we do care
Mhm.
as humans. We seek out belonging. And so if you think about that, I think it's like letting yourself feel that pain. And then I think also letting yourself figure out like, okay, what do I need to do to soothe this pain? Because this isn't like, if someone can't hear you, it's often not a you problem. It
Yeah.
is that person is not ready. They can't, whatever it is, maybe it's their own stuff coming in. And so figuring out, okay, well, what do I do to get my needs met in this moment? Maybe it's I'm not sharing anymore, but I need to be heard in a different way. So can I like call a friend about something completely random and not like that? Can I like think about things like the Recovery Collective? Can I post about this experience and see if other folks are going to be able to give me advice or hear me or share? I think about, things like simple, but like body-based self-care. So like if you're upset, like, can you find a dog or a cat or something soft? Can you wrap a blanket around you? Can you support that part of you? So I think that first and foremost, that is a moment where you aren't being seen and heard. And so you need to hear yourself and whatever it is that you need in that hurt. And then I
Mhm.
think it comes to like thinking through, okay, how do I not internalize this as me? Like, this isn't me and my space where like I said something wrong. It's me and someone else not being able to hear me. And so figuring out what that is. Because I think sometimes what happens is folks will share with someone, I think about, especially about like eating disorders, they'll share their experience with this first person and this person's caught off guard or they don't know how to respond. And so they have this really negative or maybe it's not even negative. It's just kind of a neutral, not great experience. And then folks can tend to go inward and not talk about it again for a while. I think sexual trauma is another one where that happens quite a bit. Like the first person you tell if they're not supportive can make a huge difference in then how you talk about it and experience it later and how you make meaning and kind of put that as a part of yourself and who you are
Yeah.
and your identity. And so I think if you're able to kind of be like, no, this isn't about me. What do I need in this moment? And I mean, I say that and it's very hard to do that because
Oh
it's
my
such,
gosh. Yeah.
that pain is like such a human pain, such a hard thing to figure out. Yeah.
I completely agree. It's so hard not to personalize their reaction
Hmm.
and get swept into that emotion if it is an
Yeah.
emotional response. I know it took me years to learn how to separate like someone else's emotions from like me as a person.
Mm.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like, so
Yeah.
if someone's really say they're defensive. Like I say I have an eating disorder and they feel scared, angry, and it comes out as like kind of attacking or what. It's like for the longest time I used to think, oh my gosh, I get swept into it. Like their
Mhm.
emotions are my emotions and it means something about me that they're
Mhm.
having this reaction. But it took me so long to realize like, okay, it's actually them having their own experience and I can
Yeah.
have my neutrality here, right? I
Mhm.
don't have to be pulled in. And I know it's really hard to get to that point where
Mhm.
you can see a person having their emotional response and realizing, okay, I'm going to leave that to them.
Yeah.
I'm going to let them have that. So they're going through something and it doesn't have to be because of me.
Mhm. Their inability to hear you is not because of you. And I think that's really big. And I think it is really hard. I still really, at times struggle. And I help folks with this all the time. But I think about like, if like a big thing for me is that because of my work and my past experiences, like I don't like folks talking about diets around me. Like it's just not welcome. Like I'm just
Mhm,
not for it.
mhm, mhm.
And so, if a family member talks about something and then I kind of redirect, I'm like, please don't talk about that around me. And they have an emotional reaction. I still, I'm in this space where I'm like, oh, that hurts. And I have like that moment where I very much want to be like, oh, I'm the sensitive one. And it's like, well, first of all, yes, you are, because that
Mhm.
is part of who you are. And that's okay. I like being the sensitive one. Also, that's part of my trauma is that like trauma in life makes you more sensitive.
Mm,
But then the
mhm.
other piece of like, that's actually not me being sensitive in that moment. That's them being sensitive, not being able to handle it. And so how do I then kind of be like, no, you just set a boundary. That's actually a pretty normal
Yeah,
thing to do. It's pretty powerful. It's, something we all should have access to. But we don't always have it because of our experiences in life or what we've been taught. And so I have to kind of even like affirm myself. And I think folks kind of think like, oh, well, once you figured out how to like do it or how to set boundaries, or like for me as a therapist, like, oh, you must not struggle with this. And it's like, no, I definitely do, because this is a really hard part of being human and having relationships.
yeah, and people aren't perfect with it. Like, as a
Mhm.
therapist, I'm sure, like, any therapist is not going to be perfect at setting a boundary every single time because we're all human and every situation is very different.
Mhm. Oh, for sure. And I think this would get into like a whole nother topic, but like there is a lot of professionalism placed on therapists or helping
Yeah.
professionals. And so it's like this idea that like you can't struggle, you can't have your own things. And like the thing is that as a human, we all do and we always will. And so I've kind of come to this space. And I think that also has led to some of my like online work is like, I want to challenge that because there are all of us out there trying to do our best and are struggling because we're humans, and that is innately a part of our experience. Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that. That was one thing. I think that one reason why I was drawn towards coaching was because you didn't have to have so much red tape
Hmm.
around what you are allowed to share, how you can connect with people. There's obviously professional boundaries, but there's also a little less of an expectation around
Yes.
like you can be seen as a human and not this like glossy, perfect therapist. You bring up something that I wanted to kind of connect to before we close out today, which is we've been talking about advocacy and sharing your story on a personal level, but there is this larger scale level
Hmm.
advocacy that you do around real human issues and social injustice issues. And I'm curious, what motivates you to have that voice? One, let's
Hmm.
start there.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I think it comes from that individual. Like, so I think about even like my Instagram platform. Like, I started that because I was mad. Like I came from a treatment situations where I felt like I wasn't treated well, and I was angry and no one was hearing me, and I was like, I want to scream this. I want someone to know about this. And so I had like no intentionality of being like, let me create this account that folks are actually going to follow. It was more so like, I'm frustrated, I'm angry, let me just share. And it's slowly over time become something where then like I've added more information, and like sometimes now it's more thoughtful where I'm like, okay, what am I going to engage with? How do I engage with this? But I think the piece that drives me the most is that there needs. Like, we need that. Like, I think we don't hear that. Like, especially if you think about this therapist lens, like, we don't always hear that in school. Like, the amount of things I left, and the more I get into practice, like, I left school, and then the more I get into practice, I'm like, no one talked about this with me, or I didn't realize this was an issue, or, and so it's been one of those things where I'm like, I want to be a part of this conversation, and I want to pave the way so others can be a part of this conversation. And so then I'll see, like, folks who will start talking about it in other spaces, or they'll be like sharing my content somewhere else and then encouraging more conversation. And I'm like, that's it. Like, we all need to do that. And I think in the online space, I do a lot of it, but even like in our day-to-day lives, it's important. And so having those conversations, like at my university, for example, became really big for me. And so I think that piece where you see a little bit of the change, because I am really frustrated with systems, and I am someone that likes to call out when people are being harmed. And I don't want it to be like an echo chamber where I'm just hearing myself and just talking. Like, it has to go somewhere. And I think every time I feel it go somewhere, or I feel that connection, I'm like, there's something here. And I feel like such a passion towards that and wanting more of that. I don't know if it's it does feel like a really like good feeling to have. And then I also think it just feels like, okay, like there's a system of harm. There are these things happening, but there are people out there that are connecting to try to figure out some of this, or to try to hear someone differently, or to just like have someone know that they are not alone in their experience, or that they don't have to be the perfect client, or that they don't have to be the perfect therapist, whatever it is. And so I think, that piece motivates me.
Yeah.
And then it becomes like this internal drive. Like, I was getting to the point at my old job where I would find myself sitting there, and I'd almost like hurt to sit and not say something. I just like sit there and be like, oh no, we need to talk about this. And part of it was figuring out, when do we talk about something? When don't we? Because everything is important. But I realized that's just a part of me, and that's something that I want to keep doing. I can't see a life where I don't continue to push and like try to figure out and push myself too, to be different and to realize the ways in which I've been in a system of harm, or I've been taught in a particular way, and I need to grow and learn and be different.
So I think what you shared is really interesting, because it's like you're mad at the system, right? There's a systemic issue. And in speaking out about this problem in the system that you see, you don't necessarily expect to change the whole system. But you're moving the needle and causing a ripple effect where more people are opening up and sharing their experience and talking about it because you were strong enough and maybe courageous enough to start the conversation.
Yeah. I always like to think of myself as like a good fire starter, like this idea of like, it's for good reason. We use that term really negatively. Like, some of my friends at work would call me like good trouble, or like, the professional troublemaker, where it's like just enough, just so we start to have a different conversation. And I think that's exactly it. It's just enough. And then that conversation that happens, I think, is the most important part of it. Like, where it starts to trickle off and people think about things differently. And sometimes it becomes something, and sometimes it doesn't. But that's just the space of like looking at things and doing things slightly different. And I don't think we're going to fix the system, really. I don't even know if we should fix the systems, because I think a lot of them were created in a way that are harmful. But I definitely know that we've got to be there for each other. And that's why that conversation and like that connection piece is so important.
Wow. Well, I appreciate you being one of those people who can name an issue courageously and say the thing that people are afraid to say. Because there are things I've seen on your account where I'm like, you know what? She's right. And I'm glad she brought that up. I'm just glad she brought that up. And so I appreciate that. And with that being said, because we're coming to the end of our interview, where can people follow your work? How can they find you? Because you do have a really valuable voice in this space and in other spaces. And I just want to make sure they can connect that way.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm going to say this, and if my content pisses you off or brings an emotional reaction, like, that's good. Like, that's part of it, is like all of us being able to just like question ourselves a little bit.
Can I say something there?
Yeah.
That's brilliant. And I'm so glad you brought that up. It's like when somebody who's a fighter, an advocate, or, activist says something that ignites a strong emotion in you or some sort of emotional reaction, it's time to like look in and question, like, where is
Mhm.
this coming from? What did this trigger for me? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a little signal that something needs to be looked at.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you brought that up because I'm sure there are people who might be turned off or
Mhm.
upset by some of the things they read initially.
Yeah. I think, and I like to say that because I do post some pretty forward or direct content. And I think it can be affronting to be like, oh, wow, I'm a part of this system of harm. What does that mean? And I have to say, like, I get it. I feel that all the time. Even I'll look back sometimes at posts that I've posted and be like, no, I got to look at that in myself again. Like, how am I enacting this now again? Because it's so ingrained and professionalized into me. And I think
Mm,
even like other folks' content, or like sometimes folks will call me on it and be like, actually, it's more like this, or have you thought about this? And it's like this period of like, you're right. Let me reflect on this for a second. Let me like think about this and figure out, am I sharing other content? Do I have to uplift creators? Because that's something I really like to do is be like, I'm not the voice on this. Please don't make me the voice on this, but please listen to this voice on this because they have something really important to say.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can't be the voice for everyone. We've got to be able to figure out how to get everyone to the voices.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point. It's so funny. I could keep going. But you bring up a really good point around the fact that there is a vulnerability in speaking out, which is you might also not be seeing something.
Oh, for
And
sure.
that is that's like legit terrifying to me, at least,
Mhm.
to like be like, I have this bold opinion, and then realizing like maybe you're missing a part of the story,
Mhm.
and then being corrected or like not corrected, but challenged maybe in a public space. That would be really hard.
It is, yeah. I definitely have to always like kind of have like that. Like I suck in a little bit. I'm like, oh, and at the same time, it's like, okay, good. Someone told me something. Let me stop. Let me like read what they told me and try to learn a little bit from it. And I definitely think, we are lensed from our own experiences or from the folks around us. And so then you hear other folks and you're like, yeah, actually that's different. And I think that it is vulnerable and it's important. And like, as long as you're really making a big effort to try and to be different and I also think to know when to stop, to know when to like back down and like let others talk. I think that can be really meaningful in being able to do this work.
Mhm.
And I think the call in, I always think when someone calls me in on something, like, they took the time to give me feedback. Like they thought what I'm sharing is important enough that they wanted to give me more information. Or sometimes it's like coming from a place of hurt or there's other things behind it. But I'm like, there was something there. They gave me something. And so
Wow.
I'm a big fan of like, yeah, do that. In the same way, like I think about sometimes I'll call out folks. I've been trying very hard not to make it too personal about specific people, but I think being willing to be the same, like I hope folks are calling me and sometimes they'll be like, yeah, you shared this content and I'm a little worried about it. And I'm like, thank you so much. Let's talk more about it. I think a big example of that one that's like worth talking about is, I started this account because my treatment experience and I had such a bad treatment experience, but I am also a provider in the field and I've gone to working in the field. And so I know at times I may be enacting harm. I know I do because I'm a provider in the field and that innately is part of being a provider. And that is really hard. And so grappling with that has been a part of like this whole journey of being able to take feedback and think about it. And then I think about, I'll share something about like how this happened to me in treatment and this is why it was problematic or why it should have been different. And then I'll get a lot of folks like reaching out to being like, you're right. And this was what was going on when I was working in treatment or this was. And so you get so many of the different angles of it. And so it's something where like I've really tried to, whenever I talk to folks about that, I'm like, I'm calling out my experience because that is my lived experience and I think it's worth sharing. But I am not calling out the individual provider that did that to me or I had that experience from because I recognize they're a part of a bigger system. And I think there's a reason that I'm not naming the treatment centers I went to or treatment providers for that because I understand and recognize it's so complicated and so complex.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is what feedback does. It like gives you that space to embrace nuance. I think if you would have told me to have some understanding of providers when I first started this account, I would have been like, no, absolutely not. I will not. I'm so harmed by this. And now I have a little bit of different perspective. But if someone's going to like DM me and they want to talk about their experience and they're like, I hate all of these providers and they were terrible. Yeah, that's true too, right? Like holding space for that and letting that be their experience, because they should have good expectations of care they're going to get. So it is really nuanced and really complicated.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think you're right. Everyone, I guess what it comes down to in my opinion, and it's also a hope, is that most people come into this field wanting to help people, and it might be really painful to hear that it could be harming someone unintentionally. And so that is just something a lot of people have to deal with. But I know we could go on forever.
I know.
I just want
this whole thing. I'm like, we should talk about how the only time I get likes and shares is when I say something controversial or hard, that's like a whole nother conversation too.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I think it all comes down to what it sounds like is at the end of the day, when you say something that you're afraid to say, it sparks a valuable conversation where there's going to be more narratives added to that, more layers and complexities added to that, so you can see a fuller picture. And that's really important and valuable for everybody involved. And so I thank you for kind of illuminating that for us. And like I asked you before, where can
not
people
answer the
find
question
you?
at all.
Good.
Like, we just nuanced. I have to add to it. That is like me to a core. Is like, can I add a little bit more context so we could keep making this more complicated? Yeah. So on Instagram, it's Healing Pro Healing, and I do have a website, healingprohealing.com. And then if folks wanted to work with me, if they were in the state of Virginia as a therapy client, my practice is actually listed on my website. So that's always an option too.
Amazing. Well, Courtney, I appreciate you so much. It's been very refreshing to speak with you. It's been so nice. I've missed you.
I missed you too.
Oh God. Yeah. Thank you for joining me on the show. It's been a long time coming, and I'm so grateful that you could share so much of your story today.
I appreciate that. I'm very grateful I could be here and to share a little bit of time with you, and also just the space of being in a recovery community led by you and then being able to talk about things. It's just really meaningful. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I will talk to you soon. Thank you so much. So there you have it. Another episode of Full and Thriving in the books. I want to personally thank you for joining me in listening to today's show. And if you found value in this conversation, I would be so grateful if you could please take a moment to subscribe to the show and leave a review. Your support not only helps us reach more people who are striving to live their most full and thriving life, but it also allows us to bring on even more incredible guests with valuable insights that can change your life. Every follow, every review makes a huge difference, and together we can continue to grow this beautiful community. Thanks again for being a part of the journey, and we'll see you next time on Full and Thriving.